She knelt in the dark with her hands buried in the rich, damp rot of the forest floor, and the whole town of Havenwood agreed she had lost her mind. The talk had been simmering for months, a low fire in the general store and a bitter steam over washed tubs, but now it had boiled over. To see Alara Croft, a widow of only a year, out past dusk with a lantern and a trowel, scrabbling in the earth like a badger, well, it was more than unseemly. It was proof. Proof that grief had finally untethered her from sense. They said she was digging for phantom coin her husband had buried, or that she was communing with spirits in the leaf mold. They said many things, none of them kind. What they did not know was that she was listening, not to spirits, but to the quiet arithmetic of survival, a language of sums and subtractions that had become her only catechism. And what she was digging for was not gold, but a gnarled, pale root that smelled of earth and time and the faintest whisper of hope. A hope she guarded like a coal banked low under ash, knowing that a single gust of wind, or a single scornful word, could extinguish it forever. 6 months earlier, it had all begun with a pig. Not a fine, fat, pink creature from a proper sty, but a half-wild sow named Clementine, whose bristly coat was the color of mud and whose eyes held the wary glint of a forest creature. Alara had bought her at the spring auction, the last pitiful item of the Miller estate. The auctioneer, a man whose voice was perpetually oiled with false cheer, had tried to dress her up. A fine breeding sow gentleman. A touch independent, perhaps, but with a good litter in her belly. A walking smokehouse, a future of bacon and lard. The men gathered on the dusty street had just laughed. They knew the sow, knew she was a runner, more deer than pig, prone to disappearing into the thick woods that crowded Havenwood on all sides. She was a bad investment, a fool's bargain. Alara stood at the back, her worn dress the color of a dove's wing, her hands clasped so tightly the knuckles were white. She had $112 to her name, the sum total of her husband Thomas's life insurance and the sale of his good tools. It was not enough for a horse, not enough for a new plot of land, not enough for anything that might offer a clear path forward. The arithmetic was stark. $112, to last until when? Until it was gone. She watched the sow, who stood restlessly in her pen, ignoring the jeers. The pig lifted her snout and tested the air, her gaze fixed on the distant line of oak and hickory. There was something in that wildness that Alara understood. A stubborn refusal to be penned. $1, just to start the bidding, the auctioneer boomed. Silence. Then a snicker from Jebediah Slate, a man whose opinions were as loud as his suspenders were bright. You'd have to chain that one to a church pew to keep her, and even then I'd wager on the pig. More laughter. The price dropped. 75 cents. 50. The auctioneer was sweating now, his performance falling flat. Ladies, gentlemen, this is a living animal. It was then that Silas Blackwood stepped forward. He wasn't a farmer but the town's merchant, a man who dealt in the slow accumulation of other people's debts. He owned the general store, held the note on half the farms in the valley, and dressed in town clothes even on market day. He smiled, a thin, dry parting of the lips. A young woman alone, he said, his voice carrying easily, though he did not raise it, has little use for such a troublesome beast. She needs security. Predictability. His eyes found Alara's, and his smile tightened with something that looked like pity but felt like a cage. Something inside Alara hardened. She heard the unspoken words. A young woman alone needs a man like me to manage her affairs. She thought of the numbers in her head, the dwindling sum that stood between her and dependency. A litter of 10 piglets, sold in the fall, could fetch $4 apiece. $40. A third of her entire worth, created from mud and acorns. It was a chance. A wild one, but a chance. When the auctioneer, desperate, called out, 25 cents, for the love of God. Alara's voice, quiet but clear, cut through the murmuring. $1, a collective turning of heads. Jebediah Slate stared, his mouth agape. Silas Blackwood's eyebrows rose in feigned surprise. $1.50, he countered smoothly, his gaze still on her. He was not bidding on the pig. He was bidding against her resolve. $2, Alara said, her voice a little stronger now. She did not look at him. She looked at the sow. The bidding went on, a tense, quiet battle of wills. It ended at $4.75. Alera's winning bid. A gasp went through the small crowd. Nearly $5 for the ghost pig. As she counted out the coins, her hand trembling only slightly, Jebediah shook his head. You'd have done better to sleep in the street, Alera. The ground, at least, stays put. Leading the sow home on a rope, Alera felt the weight of their judgment like a physical shroud. Clementine pulled and grunted, her powerful shoulders straining, her nose constantly testing the breeze from the woods. The small farm Alera had been left with was mostly rock and clay, with a cabin that listed to one side like a tired old man. But behind it, the forest began, a vast, untamed wilderness of shadow and secrets. Clementine seemed to know it was there. She tugged harder, a low, insistent rumble in her chest. Alera held on tight. She had made her bet. Now she had to see it through. The arithmetic had a new variable, a 400-pound question mark with a bristly hide. She had spent the money. Now, she had to make it count. She had to make the wild thing hers. Within a week, the problem began. Clementine was gone. The rope Alera had used to tether her to an old apple tree was frayed and broken, and the sow had vanished as completely as smoke. Panic, cold and sharp, seized Alera. For $1.75, wandering loose in 1,000 acres of woods. She spent the entire day calling, crashing through the underbrush, her voice growing hoarse. The mockery from town was swift and merciless. Told you so, Jebediah said with a satisfied nod when she went to the store for flour. That pig's halfway to the next county by now. Silas Blackwood offered his condolences with that same thin smile. A costly lesson, my dear. Some things are not meant to be tamed. Perhaps it is time to consider a more stable arrangement for your property. He let the offer hang in the air, smelling of dust and interest payments. Alera said nothing. She met their pity and their scorn with a quiet stillness that they took for defeat. But inside, she was calculating. The sow was pregnant. She wouldn't run far. She was foraging, not fleeing. The next morning, Alera did not go crashing into the woods. She rose before the sun, put a piece of dried bread in her pocket, and went to the place where the rope had broken. She knelt, just as she would months later in the dark, and studied the ground. She was not a tracker, but she had her husband Thomas's eyes for detail. She saw the scuffed earth, the single, clear hoofprint pointing not toward the road, but deeper into the woods. She packed the earth around it with her hands, memorizing its shape. For 3 days, this was her routine. She would find a sign, a patch of rooted-up soil, a coarse black bristle snagged on a briar, a muddy scrape on a fallen log, and she would follow it until the trail went cold. Then she would return home, do the farm chores, and study the fading light, doing the arithmetic in her head. Each day cost her. A day not mending the fence was a day the deer might get into her garden. A day not chopping wood was a day closer to a cold winter. And every day, the sow was still gone. On the 4th day, as she stood stumped at the edge of a stony creek bed, a voice startled her. You are shouting at the forest. It will not answer. It was Old Man Hemlock. He lived alone in a small cabin deeper in the woods than anyone else, a relic from the old country with a thick accent and eyes the color of faded moss. The townspeople thought him as wild as the woods he inhabited, a man who spoke more to trees than to people. He was carrying a basket of mushrooms, their caps like velvet buttons. He looked not at Alera, but at the ground where she had been staring. The pig is clever, he said, his voice a low rumble. She walks in the water where she leaves no scent, no track. He pointed a gnarled finger downstream. But she must come out. You look for the broken branch, the stone that is wet on top when all others are dry. You must learn the forest language, not shout at it with your feet. He looked at her then, his gaze direct and serious. The forest gives its best gifts only to those who walk slow. Alera felt a lifetime of frontier impatience fall away. She had been hunting the pig. She needed to be following it. That afternoon, she did as he said. She walked slowly along the creek, her eyes scanning the opposite bank. And there it was, a single stone, darker than the rest, with a tiny drip of water still clinging to its underside. A little farther on, a bent fern. The trail was faint, almost invisible, but it was there. She followed it not with her feet, but with her eyes, moving from one tiny disturbance to the next. The path led her away from the creek and up a steep, north-facing slope, into a part of the woods she had never explored. The air grew cooler here, shaded by a thick canopy of ancient maples. The ground was soft and black, a carpet of humus built up over centuries. And then she heard it, a soft, contented grunting. She pushed aside a curtain of maidenhair fern and stopped, her breath catching in her throat. Below her, in a small, misty hollow, was Clementine. She was not running. She was feasting, her powerful snout turning over the rich soil with surgical precision. But it was what surrounded the sow that made Alara's heart stop. Blanketing the floor of the hollow, in gentle, dappled light, were hundreds, perhaps thousands, of plants. Each had a single stalk that split into 3 prongs, and each prong held 5 delicate, serrated leaves. A cluster of bright red berries hung from the center of some, like a single drop of blood. Alara knew the plant. Her grandmother, a woman who carried the old ways with her, had shown it to her once, a dried, man-shaped root kept in a wooden box. Panax quinquefolius. Sang. Wild ginseng. A plant worth more than its weight in gold to the traders in the city, a root prized in faraway China as a cure for all that ailed a man. The sow, in her wildness, had not been running away from Alara. She had been running toward a treasure. Clementine had led her home. For a long moment, Alara simply watched. The quiet dignity of the sow, the dappled light filtering through the canopy, the sea of green leaves. She felt a profound sense of peace settle over her, a feeling she hadn't known since before Thomas had taken ill. This was her secret, hers and the pig's. She backed away as silently as she had come, leaving Clementine to her feast. She did not bring the sow home that day. She walked back through the woods with Old Man Hemlock's words echoing in her mind. The forest gives its best gifts only to those who walk slow. She now understood. The town saw a runaway pig. She had found a hidden garden. They saw a fool's bargain. She had discovered a quiet economy, humming with value right under their noses. That evening, she did not bother to answer the knowing looks at the store. Let them think what they would. She had a new set of numbers to calculate, a new kind of arithmetic. It was the math of patience, of seasons, of secrecy. She began her work the next day. She returned to the hollow not with a rope, but with a basket and a small trowel. She remembered her grandmother's lessons. Never take it all. Never take the young ones. Always plant the seeds. She moved through the patch with a reverence that was almost prayerful, selecting only the mature, 4-pronged plants. She dug carefully, loosening the soil in a wide circle to avoid breaking the delicate rootlets. Each root she lifted from the earth felt like a small miracle, pale and gnarled, some forked like a human form. For every root she took, she pushed the cluster of red berries into the soft earth, ensuring a harvest for years to come. She kept her success hidden like a secret spring. She washed the roots in the creek until they were clean, then carried them to the small, hot attic of her cabin. There, she laid them on screens made of old window frames and cheesecloth. The attic filled with a strange, sweet, earthy smell, the scent of her silent work. Day after day, she returned to the hollow, harvesting with the same deliberate care. Clementine was always there, her guardian. The sow would greet her with a low grunt and then return to her rooting, leaving the ginseng plants untouched. It seemed a strange pact had been formed between them. The sow had shown Alara the treasure, and in return, Alara left her to her wild freedom, visiting her daily with a bucket of slop and a scratch behind the ears. One afternoon, a small shadow fell across her work. It was Davy, the storekeeper's son, a boy of 10 with curious eyes and a quiet disposition. He had followed her, silent as a fox. He stood at the edge of the hollow, watching her. Alara's first instinct was fear. A secret shared is a secret lost. But the boy's face held no cunning, only a deep, solemn wonder. "What is it?" he whispered, pointing at a root she held in her hand. "They look like little people made of wood." Alara looked from the boy's earnest face to the root. She made a decision. "It's a secret," she said softly. "A secret the forest told me. Can you keep it?" The boy nodded, his eyes wide. From that day on, he became her silent partner. He would meet her after his chores were done and help her wash the roots in the creek, his small hands surprisingly gentle. He never spoke of it to anyone. The shared secret was a bond stronger than any promise. It was his first taste of a world beyond the dusty shelves and loud opinions of his father's store. By late summer, the attic was filled with screens of drying roots, hundreds of them, each one shrinking and hardening into a valuable commodity. Alara's hands were rough as bark, her face tanned by the dappled sunlight of the hollow. She felt a strength in her she hadn't known she possessed. It was the strength of purpose, of a secret well kept. The town still saw the poor widow Croft, a little mad, a little lost. They had no idea she was becoming the wealthiest person in Havenwood. Her fortune measured not in dollars, but in gnarled, pale roots that smelled of the deep earth. She had turned their mockery into her shield, their pity into her camouflage. While they talked, she worked. While they judged, she grew. The arithmetic was finally starting to add up in her favor. The first test of her secret came in October, with the arrival of Dr. Alastair Finch. He was not the town's physician, but an herbalist and apothecary from a city to the east, a man who traveled the backwoods in a dusty wagon filled with glass bottles and brass scales, buying medicinal plants from those who knew where to look. He set up on the porch of the general store, his sophisticated spectacles and neat coat a stark contrast to the worn denim and calico of Havenwood. The locals brought him bundles of yarrow and dried mullein, which he inspected with a dismissive air, paying them pennies. He was looking for something more. Anything of real value in these hills? He asked the men gathered, his tone suggesting he already knew the answer. Jebediah Slate scoffed. Nothing but rock and regret, mister, but young Davy, who had been quietly sweeping the porch, stepped forward. Sir, he said, his voice small but clear, Mrs. Croft has roots. Silas Blackwood, who had been observing the proceedings with a proprietary air, shot the boy a look of sharp annoyance. Dr. Finch, however, raised an eyebrow. What sort of roots, son? Secret ones, Davy said, and would say no more. Intrigued, the doctor made his way to Alara's small farm. He found her splitting firewood, the rhythmic thud of her axe a steady heartbeat in the crisp autumn air. She paused, wary as he approached. He explained his purpose, his city manners slick and polished. The boy at the store mentioned you might have something of interest. Alara studied him for a long moment. She saw the keen, appraising look in his eyes, the look of a man who understood value. She made a quiet calculation, then nodded and led him not to the attic, but into her cabin. From a locked wooden chest, her grandmother's, she took out a single, perfect root. It was at least 30 years old, she judged, with a thick neck and a body forked into two distinct legs, a perfect man shape. It was the king of her harvest, a root she had almost felt sacrilegious digging up. She laid it on the simple plank table. Dr. Finch leaned forward, his professional indifference vanishing like mist. He drew in a sharp breath. He did not touch it at first, merely circling the table, peering at the root from all angles. He produced a small magnifying glass from his waistcoat and examined the concentric rings on its neck, counting the years. My word, he murmured. This is wild mountain-grown. Of the highest grade, he finally picked it up, his touch surprisingly reverent. He broke off a tiny piece and placed it on his tongue, his eyes closing as he savored the complex, bittersweet taste. When he opened them again, his gaze on Alara was one of pure, unadulterated respect. Madam, he said, his voice stripped of all condescension, what you have here is not a root. It is a treasure. I will give you $20 for this one piece. $20. For a single root. The price was so high it was nonsensical. It was more than she'd earned in the entire previous year. It was the price of a good milk cow, of a new plow. It was vindication, sitting there on her table. The arithmetic in her head spun wildly. If one root was worth this, what was the value of her entire attic? The number was staggering, beyond her comprehension. She looked at the doctor's eager face and drew on her hard-won stillness. That seems a fair price, she said, her voice betraying nothing of the storm inside her. He paid her in 4 shining $5 gold pieces, coins she hadn't seen since her wedding day. After he had gone, she held the coins in her palm, their weight a solid, undeniable proof. It had worked. Her gamble, her patience, her secret labor, it had all worked. That evening, she brought Clementine 2 buckets of warm mash and a handful of windfall apples. The sow, now heavy with her coming litter, nudged Alara's hand with her wet snout, a gesture of quiet complicity. The two of them, the fool and the runaway, had made their fortune. The first snow came early that year, a week before Thanksgiving. It was not a gentle dusting but a thick, wet blanket that bent the pines and snapped the branches of the oaks. It did not melt. A hard freeze followed, locking the land in a grip of iron. The roads became treacherous, then impassable. Havenwood was cut off. What began as a nuisance soon became a threat. A sickness arrived with the cold, carried on the wind. It started as a dry cough, a fever that came and went, but it soon settled deep in the lungs, a grinding, relentless affliction that stole the breath and left its victims weak and gasping. They called it lung fever. Dr. Adams, the town physician, a good man worn thin by years of service, quickly exhausted his small supply of quinine and laudanum. He sent a rider for supplies from the city, but the man returned 2 days later, his horse lame, reporting that the mountain pass was blocked by a rock slide and 10 feet of snow. They were on their own. The coughs grew worse, echoing from every cabin. Fear, colder than the wind, began to seep under the doorways. It was in this climate of isolation and dread that Silas Blackwood revealed the true nature of his character. He still had a few crates of Dr. Kilmer's swamp root tonic and other patent medicines in his store's warehouse. He brought them out, but the prices had changed. A bottle that had cost $1 in October now cost $5. Supply and demand. He explained to the desperate faces before him, his expression one of regretful necessity. It is simple economics. He refused all credit. Cash only. Jebediah Slate's wife, Martha, was among the first to be struck down hard. Her breath came in ragged, shallow rasps. Jebediah, his usual bluster gone, his face a mask of grave fear, stood before Blackwood's counter, his hat in his hands. "Silas, for the love of God. I can pay you come spring. I swear it." Blackwood shook his head slowly. "I cannot run a business on promises, Jebediah. You know that. A young woman alone might be able to live on hope, but a town needs commerce." He glanced toward Alara, who was at the back of the store buying flour and salt, her purchases paid for with one of her gold coins. She seemed the only calm person in the room. She was well supplied, her woodshed full, her face clear and unworried. Blackwood's eyes narrowed with a flicker of suspicion. How was it that the widow Croft was thriving while everyone else was beginning to founder? It did not fit his arithmetic. Pride and poverty were supposed to go hand in hand. Her quiet solvency was an affront to the natural order of things. The sickness deepened its hold on the town. By mid-December, there was hardly a family untouched. The sound of coughing was the town's new church bell, tolling day and night. The small cemetery on the hill saw 3 new graves, frozen earth hacked out with picks and fury. Dr. Adams was a ghost, moving from cabin to cabin, his face etched with the exhaustion of a man fighting a war with no weapons. He could do little more than offer comfort, to cool brows with snow water and whisper useless reassurances. The town's spirit began to fray. Neighbor eyed neighbor with suspicion. A hoard of firewood, a sack of flour, a healthy milk cow. These were no longer signs of provident husbandry, but objects of bitter envy. Silas Blackwood, meanwhile, grew richer. His ledger filled with new debts as desperate families traded future harvests for his overpriced remedies, which did little more than dull the pain. He saw the town's collapse not as a tragedy, but as an opportunity. Land would soon be cheap. He began to pay visits, cloaked in a mantle of false concern. He came to Alara's farm one afternoon, his horse picking its way carefully through the deep snow. He found her in the barn, tending to Clementine, who was now enormous, her delivery imminent. The barn was warm, clean, and filled with fresh straw. "Alara, my dear," he began, his breath pluming in the cold air. "I have been worried for you. A winter like this, it is too much for a woman to bear alone." He gestured vaguely at her small, sturdy homestead. "I would not see you suffer. I am prepared to make you a generous offer for this place. Enough to see you settled comfortably with relatives in the city, away from all this hardship." Alara stopped her work and looked at him. His generosity was a predator's smile. She saw the calculation in his eyes, the way they scanned her full woodshed, the healthy sheen on the pig's coat, the smoke curling from her chimney. He was prospecting, looking for the source of her unnatural security. "I am not suffering, Mr. Blackwood," she said, her voice even. "I am content here." His smile faltered. "Contentment does not fill an empty stomach, my dear. When your supplies run low, they will not," she said, cutting him off. It was not a boast, but a simple statement of fact. For the first time, he seemed to see the steel in her, and he did not like it. His voice took on a colder edge. Pride is a bitter meal, Alara. You would do well to remember who your friends are. He turned and left without another word, his boots crunching angrily in the snow. As she watched him go, Alara knew that his suspicion had now hardened into a dangerous certainty. He knew she had something, and he would not rest until he found out what it was. The arithmetic of survival had a new, more dangerous variable: human greed. The turning point came during the week of Christmas, the coldest and darkest of the year. Jebediah Slate's wife, Martha, was fading. Dr. Adams emerged from their cabin, his shoulders slumped in defeat. "There's nothing more I can do," he told Jebediah, his voice rough with despair. "Her lungs are filling. She needs a miracle." That night, the doctor, unable to sleep, remembered the apothecary's visit in the fall. He remembered the man's excitement, the hushed rumors of a root of astonishing quality found somewhere in their own hills. He remembered Davy's words, "Mrs. Croft has roots." It was a long shot, a desperate hope, but it was all he had left. He made his way through the moonlit snow to Alara's farm. He found her sitting by the fire, mending a sack. She listened patiently as he told her of his desperation, of the town's suffering. "I know it's a fool's errand," he finished, his voice cracking. "But the apothecary, Finch, he said you had something of value. I don't know what it is, but if there is any chance." This was the moment Alara had been preparing for, though she hadn't known it. This was the final column in her long and patient sum. She held the town's fate in her hands. She could have named any price. She could have demanded the deed to Blackwood Store. She could have asked for $100 a root and become a legend of avarice. The temptation was there, a bitter, satisfying whisper, to make them pay for every jeer, every pitying look, to show them what her foolishness was truly worth. Instead, she stood up,